you, Angela. Am I the host? I can't see how to let people in. I'm
I
not.
made you the co-host.
Okay.
It's coming from the top. Here, I'll let people in if you.
Okay. I can't.
I'll admit all right now.
Thank you. There's something different about my screen today. I don't know what you guys are doing, being all fancy, but I guess I have to. I've given over control to you guys.
It doesn't have the let people in option.
I think Angela's doing
Here,
it.
Pearson and Oscar, yeah, they're all.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Filmmaker's Life after our Thanksgiving break. Good to have you all back. And I want to welcome Ken Paul Rosenthal to meet you all. As I was just telling Ken, I've already shared his bio. I've already told you about him, and I put some links, which we're also going to put in the chat at some point. And we're going to, so that you can see some of his films that we're also going to end up talking about, I think. And as always, Ken, I would like to start with the question, which is, when did you first know that you were a filmmaker?
Mm.
When did that dawn on you? And were you scared?
Well, well, I can't think of the word filmmaker without thinking of the name of your podcast, which is The Life of a Filmmaker.
Uh-huh.
So for me, it's not just about being a career, it's a practice. And being a practice and having a career are interdependent, they inform one another. So when I think of the roots of my practice, the real beginning goes all the way back to my childhood. And I have three very specific memories. The very first memory, in fact, the earliest memory of my life is when I was 4 years old and I was standing in a doorway to our living room. And I had a very tactile sense of a frame. And if there's nothing else, that's the foundation of all filmmaking, it's to have a sense of the frame, because the frame is not only shows what we see, but how we see. And the next memory is having a box camera. I had a little box camera with 120 millimeter roll film in it. And being a little kid, I was fiddling with it and I opened it up and the film fell out. And it was like a fish out of water. It was quivering in the wind and it was all gray, of course. And the light was glistening on its surface. And of course, I was too young to feel like I had lost something. I really didn't have an awareness of developed picture from this film specifically, but it gave me a sense of the tactility of the medium itself. And it sort of planted a seed of fascination with the inner workings of the mechanics of a camera. And then the third memory, and the one which most distinctly connects to my mental health film documentaries, is staring at the sun when I was a kid at length, like a moth. I was just really fascinated with how long I could stare at the sun, even if it hurt, even if tears were rolling down my eyes, and this sort of twin attraction to something that was, you know, the heart of filmmaking, light. But of course, it's the interplay of light and dark that allows us to perceive motion in film and video. And I was also, by staring at the sun, sort of drawn to something that could literally fry my retinas, not unlike a moth. So the commingling of all these things sort of like planted seeds, the tendrils of which grew over the course of my life into what I would call, you know, my career as a filmmaker.
Wow, I love all those stories. I have a feeling that last one is going to come back. I don't know if you might be going to mention Stan Brakhage, but I don't know. That's whose work I saw when you were telling that story. And I was telling you the other day when we were talking that you're the first filmmaker that I've had to interview who I really think of as coming from an experimental space, which is also the space that I come from. And I don't get to talk about it very much. But so after and I love the child, anytime anybody gives me the childhood stories, I love it the most. So thank you. But so after those childhood experiences, what actions did you actually take to going towards film?
Okay, I could speak for an hour about that, so let me try my best to be
I
brief. Um, you know, all I ever wanted to do my whole life since first grade was teach. I was in love with my art teacher, Mr. Wallace, and I knew from first grade I just wanted to teach. And by the time I arrived at high school, I had discovered ceramics and all, excuse me, all I wanted to do, all I wanted to do was teach ceramics. And then in my last semester in high school, they give you these tests that are so insidious. The acronym is COPS, COPS, which stands for Career Option Placement Standards.
Oh my
They
God.
asked you 100 multiple choice questions, and that plotted out what you're supposed to do for the rest of your life. So it didn't say ceramic teacher, and it certainly didn't say artist. It said communications. And so my options were public relations, speech, journalism, and communications.
Huh.
So communications was broad enough that when I started investigating various undergraduate college programs, there was one that said film and radio, TV, film. And I felt that film was something I liked, so why not?
Huh.
And I know that sounds very pedestrian, but I just sort of fell into it.
Huh.
And it was really a matter then of what films were you exposed to in a film history class? Because the technical side of the program, even the aesthetic side in terms of instruction, was really unremarkable and unformed. However, when you see Metropolis for the first time, or you see an Eisenstein montage for the first time when you're 18 years old, just all these alarm bells went off in my spirit and my soul. So that, again, only planting seeds though, because, when you're 18 years old, and this is something I think we should all get into at some point over the course of our conversation, is this sense of making a hard and fast decision at a certain age, as easily as declaring a college major that you're going to be a filmmaker. It's just not like walking through a door or having the right camera. Like Maya Deren said, cameras don't make films, filmmakers make films. So, it's great that we have the accessibility and the democratization of the medium and the technology these days, but there's a lot more work we need to do before we can really call ourselves a filmmaker with a capital F. So to finish up here, the real shifting point, what finally consecrated all these things I've been talking about in an identity as filmmaker with a capital F, was, speaking of Stan Brakhage, I arrived in San Francisco en route to Hollywood because I was so naive. I thought that, oh, I want to be a director with a capital D. So I'm going to go to Hollywood. And what you do in Hollywood is you sweep floors and you serve coffee, and then you slowly work your way up the ladder. It's sort of this old studio system,
Right.
mentality. And without giving you the whole backstory, en route to San Francisco, to Hollywood, I took a detour through San Francisco and never left. And I never left for two very clear reasons. The very first one was the quality of the light, getting back to light, but in a more sort of compassionate way, not staring at the sun. Light in San Francisco has a very tactile quality to it. It has a scent. You could smell it, you could taste it, you could hold it in your hands. And I found that intoxicating. The other thing was, I was in a cafe, never been in a cafe in my life. Never, back then we had bulletin boards with all the notices tacked up on them. Just
Yes.
visually, I love that. I love the collage effect of that. But I was reading about a filmmaker that was coming to the San Francisco Art Institute named Stan Brakhage. And the film still from his magnus opus, Dog Starman, and the description of it sounded really intriguing. Stan Brakhage is a bear of a spirit, just larger than life, came roaring out of the blocks when he spoke and taught and presented. And this film showed me the color of my soul. Literally, it gave pictures and pulse to what I felt inside that I had no sense of at the age of 22 when I arrived in San Francisco. And it was clear that this is the path for me. This is the direction I had to go. I knew I was a filmmaker. I knew these were the kinds of films I had to make. And I became utterly intoxicated, impassioned. For the next 10 years, I had to spend about 10 years trying not to make Stan Brakhage films.
Right, right, right. You know, when you went back to your childhood story about the film falling out and the tactile quality, you know, I started out in Super 8 film. And so most filmmakers today don't have that experience. They don't have that tactile experience with film. And I think that Stan Brakhage's work to me is so much about that tactile quality in film.
Yeah.
Do you think that's true? I think it's in your
Yeah,
work.
and what makes me sad, and let me just say very clearly, I'm not a Luddite. You know, I may have come up in an analog world, like many of us, and thank God, and I'm wired for, you know, light as something that's reflected, not emitted. And for many years, I called myself a purist, and I was really proud of that. I arrived at the digital side of things very, very late. But you know, our senses, and by extension our sensibilities, are governed by the animate world. You know, they evolved in what is real and concrete, not the virtual. So whereas Brakhage and experimental filmmaking reified all that, I think we really need, just as human beings, I'm not even talking about as filmmakers, be very, very wary of the extent to which you want to completely subsume to the virtual side of being a human being. So I'm not saying pick up a Bolex or a Super 8 camera. And I mean, I haven't shot film in probably, well, over 10 years now. But again, filmmaking is not just about making films. It's a practice. Whether or not you consider yourself an artist, I don't care if you're just shooting corporate films and commercials. If you're part of the film industry, there's still a person who is making the work. We're not machines. And I think we really, as we evolve as a species, you know, I'm sorry, I hope I'm not getting too esoteric,
I'm
but I
loving it.
really do feel these things inform being a filmmaker.
Yeah, I'm loving everything that you're saying. I don't know about everybody else, but it all speaks to me. So keep going. But so given that you had this sort of aesthetic, I think one of the things I maybe heard you say was that it's really important, you know, what we put into our heads as kind of film history. And again, it's like coming from an experimental art film side, I feel as though we understand that a bit more. I'm not sure, even if people go to film school, how much film history they get. I don't know anymore. But what might be some of the films that were either, or filmmakers who were really inspirational for you, or who you think that other filmmakers would really take a look at? You mentioned Maya Deren so in passing, but for me, Maya Deren is it, you know.
It's funny, you know, when you think about your antecedents and your favorites and your heroes, sometimes it's not the films they make, but it's the people they are, you know, and it's the things they write about, the way they speak. Maya Deren, I don't love Maya Deren films, but I love Maya Deren. And let me say one last thing about experimental before I earmark some other films that have been inspiring for me. I'm kind of over experimental in a lot of ways, and I
Huh.
love the spirit of it, and I still go to see them every now and then. But more often than not, I'm really, really frustrated. I feel like all of us as creative beings, be again, just as humans or as filmmakers, regardless of what stripe of filmmaker you are, you know, experimentation is at the heart of just our aliveness. And we live for our obstacles as much as we don't like them, be they financial or, you know, just in terms of our resources in general, or do we have enough people working to support our efforts? Because the obstacles give us new ways of seeing. And that's the heart of experimental, you know. I got to be careful not to make broad broad generalizations about what experimental is or isn't. But the reason why I've become sort of disenchanted with experimental film as a film goer, as an audience member, is that I'm often seeing the same things over and over and over. And I think as I've got, and experimental film fit in so well for me, and I think, if I may say, all young filmmakers, especially students of film, is because with experimental film, very generally, very broadly put, the form is the content. As opposed to the medium being a carrier for content, the form itself is the content. And that's a great place to begin. And again, I really want to be very clear. I'm not saying that you can't be 75 years old and declare yourself an experimental filmmaker and make films that are just, colors and scratches and hand processed. But I am fine with all those formal strategies supporting a narrative. As I've gotten older, I'm 58 now. So as a mid-career artist and a midlife person, the narratives of my lives are piling up. I've been around the block more. I have more to say. There's more I want to hear. I don't want to just look. I want to be informed, and I want to be inspired. So when I leave the theater or, my engagement with the medium, and it does not even just film, any art form at all, I want my frame of the world to be enlarged. And that can only happen when there is story. I got to be careful of saying that, because again, I don't want to be exclusionary, but for me, it happens more when I'm not just looking at something that is experimenting with the formal qualities of the medium, but there is a story, there are changes, there are beats, there are obstacles for the hero, if there is a hero or heroine, to overcome. So I've become really, really interested in narrative. So if you think about Crooked Beauty, which is my first mental health themed documentary, it was shot in Super 8. It's obviously, the images are very lyrical and light drenched, but I made very, very conscious decisions to frame images that embody the inner world of the hero, of the heroine, of Jax McNamara.
So
yeah,
sorry to interrupt, but so before Crooked Beauty, when you were at that point where you said, I'm a filmmaker, when you did your COPS test and you said, I am a filmmaker, did you then start out by making what we were now referring to as experimental films? Between then and Crooked Beauty, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. But you know what, even from my, I think it would be my third film, Blackbirds, I was always interested in narrative. I just didn't have enough life experience to really articulate narratives. So yeah. So I guess I'm thank you for keeping me from going down that rabbit hole at this point of Crooked Beauty. All I was trying to say was I was really interested in telling someone's story, and it had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I know that's not the only way to construct a narrative or to articulate a story, but my God, does that framework work? It works so well. It's really, really fascinating.
Yeah, the only reason I stopped you is because I like to know how a filmmaker gradually gets to a place where, because for me, Crooked Beauty is such a beautiful story. And we're going to talk more about it, but I just kind of want to know a little bit about the evolution up until there.
I think another thing that comes up now as you say that is, I don't think there's any such thing as a closet filmmaker. It's meant to be seen on a large screen. And when I say large screen, I don't necessarily mean in a theater, but just something that's larger than the frame in which you initially made the film or saw what the subject of your film through. And I wanted to get out of the micro cinemas. Now with Crooked Beauty, and hopefully someday in the future, I love touring and presenting at a variety of different venues, including micro cinemas. But as an experimental filmmaker, my audience, and by extent, my distribution, my outreach, all that was very, very limited. So there came a point where I started thinking about making bigger films that can meet, with larger stories that would be of interest to a broader and more diverse audience. I didn't want to just show to people who loved experimental film. So I threw the gauntlet down for myself. I didn't have anything to say, though. That's the thing. I feel like a lot of my early work is half realized because I was half realized in my ambitions. I never really pushed anything. And can I say one last thing?
Go
I
ahead.
think that it's often not what we aspire to, but what we find along the way. That whole cliche about life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. And I just walked into my apartment one day in 2005, and laying on the coffee table was a book by the subject of my next film, a magazine.
Uh-huh.
It was really by an organization she had formed called the Icarus Project, a radical mental health organization. And I read a essay that she had written. And by the way, I should refer to her as they. She prefers the pronoun they. So just so you're not confused. And they wrote an essay called The Anatomy of Flight. And it spoke about their mental health struggles. And I identified with that so profoundly, especially because they expressed it in the context of light. And as a filmmaker, I could get down with that.
Yes.
So I called this person. They happened to live across the bay in Oakland. And 2 days later, we met in person and I pitched the film. And 5 years later, I completed it. And all of a sudden, mental health, now that's a prescient subject. Everyone struggles with mental health in some way. We're all on some sort of spectrum, whether or not you have a pathology. It's always in the news, even more so 10 years later. So here I had a film that was poetically lensed. I won't call it an experimental film, but it's very, very lyrical. You didn't see the person speaking for the entire film except for the first 45 seconds. And it was a huge, or relatively huge, commercial and critical success. I made a living off this Super 8 film. For 3.5 years, I toured internationally with it.
I love it. I love it. So before when I so rudely interrupted, I was going to say that something about the way that you're talking about this, the thing you kept bringing up about I wasn't fully realized yet as a person, reminded me of a Native American saying I heard years ago, which said that they don't believe that artists have anything to say until they're 30. And I just think it's a very interesting kind of perspective. It's sort of the idea that you want to be an adult before you start putting a message out into the world. I'm not saying I've adopted that or anything like that, but just that that's kind of what it was reminding me. But then it also seemed as though when you saw that article in that magazine, that there's this sort of creative flash.
Epiphany.
Yeah, yeah.
The
Where
waters had parted.
yeah, and that I was telling you, what did you call it? The radical mental health movement?
The radical mental health movement, and the name of the organization, which still exists to this day, is the Icarus Project.
Yeah, and I had heard about this radical mental health movement about 5 or 6 years ago, something like that. But I was blown away by it when I heard about it. And you obviously heard about it a lot earlier. Could you say a little bit about what their thinking and philosophy is?
Very, very briefly, I think people should really just look it up themselves because the organization has grown in ways, and I've sort of now sort of left the movement and moved on. But it still deeply informs things that stay with me to this day. So briefly, they turn the disease model of mental health on its head. So instead of looking at us as being diseased and damaged and screwed up in our heads, what one of the co-founders called the biochemical knot, that identifying with who and how we are, for better or for worse, from the neck up, is really problematic. Instead of that paradigm of medicine being the silver bullet to our wellness, let's start considering madness as a reflection of a social condition. How has what preceded us, how are we inherited trauma from generations before us? How are just our behaviors in the world? Are we watching the news? Are we doom scrolling? Are we not taking care of our fundamental wellness, getting enough sleep, eating breakfast, 3 square meals a day? I'm guilty of betraying all those. I don't know about you, but here's another thing. You know, we're all very porous beings. I'm unusually sensitive. And that's what the Icarus Project, I love this language so much. Jax wrote about this in that early essay. They called it a dangerous gift. So as artists, you know, we're extremely fertile. We've got very fertile imaginations. We're very porous. We absorb things from around us very, very easily, even from behind us to the sides, not just what's right and square in front of us. And if you're that porous like a sponge, you're soaking up things that you really may not be comfortable sitting with. But it's a gift too, because then now this is what our job is. Those are the obstacles. That's the grist that we have to refashion and reframe for the world, not just for ourselves.
Right.
So I really feel, again, film as a career, film's a practice. You know, I love what the Icarus Project and being involved with radical mental health for 14 years did for me was help me realize that I'm not making films anymore to make films. Rather, I'm making films now to be in service to the world. That is really important to me.
Beautiful.
And when you sorry, last thought, when you think of your career, if you want to call it that, or your practice in this manner, wow, it lets go of so much of like the awards, the acknowledgement. You know, really the acknowledgement is the doing, not just the process of making the film, but your interaction with your audience. So whether what we're doing right now, I like thinking of film as a conversation, and that's why Crooked Beauty, I feel, was so effective. Not just because I showed it with people and spoke about it. And if people want, we can get into my concept behind the making of the film, but there are writings about it on my website. The one thing I wanted to earmark was that film functions like radio. So you don't have a picture of the speaking subject. You have to work more actively to ground the narrative, the voiceover, into what you're seeing. So it was a very activated relationship. It was a dynamic. The film was speaking to the audience, and the audience, in a sense, was speaking back to the film. And that was a very activated experience for me that I never, either as a viewer or a maker, experienced. And I really almost didn't anticipate that. I was just really surprised to experience and observe it. It was really, really enlivening and completely changed my relationship to what it meant to have a career as a filmmaker. It's really more like the name of this podcast, The Life of a Filmmaker.
The very early on in the conversation, you said even if your practice or even if your filmmaking is making commercials, you know, and I love that you said that, because I think a lot of times filmmakers and aspiring filmmakers in particular, I find, have a lot of kind of hierarchical thinking about what film is and what it's supposed to be and things like that. And I love it when a filmmaker is taking, you know, a really basic genre like a horror film or a thriller or something like that, but being able to get their message out that they could choose to get out in any number of ways. They could choose a drama, they could use a radio show, they could choose a painting, you know, but they're getting a message out within a frame that's perhaps very strict in some ways, but that they can still get that message out. And I think that's what you were saying, that your experience was with Crooked Beauty. You suddenly had follow, yes, that's awesome. Follow your own weird, yes. And that moment that hit you, that epiphany that hit you, was really a cross between art on the one hand and then something really extraordinarily important and a revolutionary way of thinking. That's what it struck me when I came across this, just a revolutionary way of thinking about my own mind and the minds of people who are either labeled mentally ill or regular people, people who are not labeled, people who are not labeled but have positions of power. That, you know, all of that comes across, but there's a message, and you really got to be able to do that with an audience.
Here's the thing, you know, society, particularly Western culture, but perhaps any culture that you're born into, has very, very clear narratives or overt narratives, like a monkey on your back, that you carry around for much of your life about what you're supposed to do, what constitutes value, how can you feel successful. And these narratives can be very, very constricting, very, very limiting. On the one hand, you know, I may have been very blessed, been born into a family where my parents were always nothing less of supportive of me tripping my own fantastic, of my own path. But that wasn't enough. You know, there's still the world at large had a voice that was much, much larger. It was only until maybe a couple years ago that I really felt grounded in who and how I was as a human being, and by extension an artist, or maybe an artist and then a human being. I don't know. They're all mixed up, and as a filmmaker. But we really have to. I think community is really the bedrock of all of this. I think we have to just, more than the right camera, more than the funding, more than the idea, you have to find a community in which you can thrive, and follow, you know, find your people and fellow travelers who are not just who will mirror back the aspects of you that you most need to hear. That's probably the single most important thing that I would say to anyone to find their career. I mean, no one's going to say that. It's as simple as it is profound and radical. And I think that's why how experimental film and the radical mental health movement played into that, because they gave me a context that completely, you know, subverted the mainstream notions of what a film looks like and what we're supposed to look like and feel like as human beings.
And I think that it's funny. When I work with my clients, I have these different modules, and the last one is called community. And it's because I see that building community as in building your audience, building your team around you, and building your funding community are all part of the filmmaker's life. So in a practical sense, would you talk about how you said that, you know, you made a living from this film for 3.5 years, which I didn't. I thought it was only a year or two. I've been saying, oh, it's a year or two. 3.5 years is awesome. Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yeah, and just to be clear, when I say 3.5 years, I mean like a steady income stream. I still have residual royalties, you know, that are minor, but it's still funds are trickling in.
Yeah.
But given the prescientness of the subject matter, it was really clear that this was just not a one-off, that I was just going to go to festivals and then be done with it, like all my prior work. And it was really clear that I could monetize this film, but also by touring, engage my audience. So it's all about, and again, this is all stuff you probably, all of you have heard before. It's just marketing 101 and distribution 101. Find your audience. So the thing is with my audience, well, again, we're all on a spectrum. Mental health is just not for people who have been given a label or who are sitting in a psych ward, or have just had some sort of major breakdown in their life. We've all had iterations of that. But it was still like, this is not exactly a mainstream film because it was so poetically lensed. It was not feature length. It's an odd length of, you know, half an hour. Actually, it's more like 32 minutes with even odder length. So it did really well at film festivals. That was where I started. And it won a number of awards. And then I started selling the film. And I started selling the film through my website. And then I started touring. And I reached out to nonprofit, peer support mental health organizations. I also reached out to college psychology programs. I also reached out to mental health symposia. So when I would book a tour, I would find one place that said yes. And I'd get for schools, for example, and this has changed a lot. So I'm almost afraid to tell you how much has changed in the last 10 years, but just to give you an idea of how this kickstarted for me back in 2010, they would pay me $700 just to speak. They also pay for my airfare. They would pay food per diem, and they put me up in a hotel. And then once one school said, yes, we're on board, then I would build the tour around that region to all those places, other schools,
Right.
other peer support networks, uh, anything that was related to mental health or that was related to film as an art form, I would reach out to. So it was a lot of work. You know, when I went to Massachusetts, I had, I think it was 10, maybe 11 presentations in just 7 days. It was really work, but it was so enlivening. And I sold, you know, back then I was dragging around a suitcase full of DVDs. So it was cash. I remember going to one mental health, I think it was called Creativity and Madness. It's a mental health symposium. I think that to this day happens 4 times a year in various locations around the world. And after a presentation, people were lined up in the aisle, and I couldn't put the cash in my wallet fast enough. I made $1,000 in DVD sales in half an hour. It was extraordinary. And I'm not trying to be, I hope I'm not coming across as egoistic. This was just such a paradigm shift for how I experienced being a filmmaker. You know, you usually just had your micro cinema screening and that was it.
Right.
You know, what was happening here? I think it was a combination. I won't reiterate what I've already said over the course of this talk, but it was all those things came to fruition in this one film. Subject matter, form, finding your audience, finding yourself, making film to be in service. People rose up and met you. And, you know, it's a way it became reciprocal. You know, you're supporting, you're giving to your audience gives back to you.
And did you do all of the work? Like there's a level of tedium. I once worked on, I was a social media outreach coordinator for a film that was dealing with blues and prison reform. So, you know, I had all these spreadsheets of lists of blues organizations and lists of prison justice reform organizations. Did you do all of that work yourself?
Oh my God. It was so much work. It was so tedious. It was hell. I got to tell you. At first, it was very energizing and exciting, but you know, I was a one-man show all those years, and it was absolutely exhausting. If there's and if I ever, I think for this current film, if I can find the funding for it, I would hire someone to do that, and someone who's an expert at it, because I'm not a social media expert. And I'm off Facebook after being on it for years, and because it was a valuable tool.
Yeah.
But I no longer want. I mean, I don't even have a cell phone. I don't like to be so engaged in those ways in the world, as practical as they can be. So you know, when this current project is done, which I hope will be in about 2 years, I really hope the funding is there to hire someone. So that's my advice to anyone. I think it's good to try it, you know, because it's not rocket science. It's just a
No.
hell of a lot of work. I think you have to be very, very clear in the spirit of what Joanna was just saying. Have a list of friends, have a list of people who are, for example, mental health professionals. Have ones, you know, since I taught for 10 years, from 2000 and 2010, I had another list of just people who taught in higher education, people who I met, the mailing lists I met as I made as I toured over the years. So that's a separate list as well. I really try to break it down, because I think when you're doing outreach and marketing and distribution, your ask is very different for each audience, for each recipient. And when I say very different, I just mean like you may use different language. You may be more formal in one group of people's ask, and more colloquial and friendly in another. It's really important to shape shift to your audience when you're doing distribution and outreach.
So it seems that, you know, for several years then you were making films in that mental health space, and that community. And so now your next film, your latest film that you're working on is, would you say it's still in that space or not? I'm from what
Well,
I've seen.
I got to first very qualify why I was laughing when you say space, because you know, the thing about when you go deep, any of you all probably know, when you go dive deep into making a project, it becomes your life partner. You're sleeping with it. You're making love with it. And the stories of your subject and the story of your own life become so intertwined. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. And I'm making these stories about people with profound mental health struggles. And, you know, I was losing my own sense of well-being.
Uh,
And so when you talk about the space, you know, I'm glad to be out of that space of making films that are squarely focused on mental health. Yes, there were first-person narratives, people telling their stories of their struggles, but it was everything they spoke about was related almost immediately to mental health.
mm,
Now I've moved away from that, and it's better for my own sense of wellness. So that's something I feel very strongly that I hope you'll all consider in your own relative life, that the work you make is an important part of your wellness. I mean, you should love what you're doing. You know, you shouldn't be making it because you have to make it or you're supposed to. I mean, make it because you find it enlivening, not just the process of making the film, but the subject matter. There has to be something that's so intrinsically fascinating about what you're doing that will not only sustain what could be years. You know, the person who writes my grants, she made a film that took her 10 years to make. I thought Crooked Beauty took a long time at 5. So not only sustain the whole trajectory of making the film, but will also sustain you as a human being, because it's a human being who is the filmmaker. So this is one reason why I left. It is the reason why I left making mental health themed films. Now I'm making a film about an artist who is a person with disabilities.
ah,
And obviously it overlaps with mental health,
yep.
but it's more about the life of this person as a marginalized artist, a poet, Julia Vinograd, who I first met all the way back when I was 22 in San Francisco.
Oh,
And here now, all these decades later, I've returned to this woman. So it's been a really, really nice arc, because I first tried to make a film about a certain set of her poems back when I was 25, several years after having met her. And I just wasn't evolved enough as a filmmaker or a human being, again, because they're interdependent, to do justice to her legacy, her work. And in fact, I wasn't even thinking about her legacy and her life. I was thinking just about the poems themselves.
uh,
Now, all these decades later, enriched as a human being, having a deeper interest in narrative, I'm not presenting her work just for the poems themselves. I'm presenting the social and political milieu in which she produced this work. So it not only informs her work more for the viewer, it informs the viewer's sense of her life and the times in which she made the work. So again, thinking about, it's just really nice to be a mid-career artist, I guess what I'm trying to say, and to really have a lot more clarity about not only what you want to make films about, but how you want to do it so that it will be of more interest to your audience and more sustainable for you as a person.
well, we haven't, I think, quite said that your films about mental health, or the ones that I'm familiar with, the one about Bonfire Madigan, that's not her full name, right? But it's also the cross between mental health or madness and artist creativity, right?
Mm.
There's that. So now it seems as though this film is going more towards the artist, the creative. And a film that you mentioned, I think it's somewhere in your bio, that I just saw recently, and I'm not going to be able to say the name of it, but it's Symbiosis Black Sim. What do you know what that is? Oh, I thought you were going to say yes, I know. It's about an artist in San Francisco, black artist, poet who was very, very marginalized. And I just saw it recently. I'll find it and send it to you. So
Okay, sure.
yeah. So what is it that you're looking at in this film about Julia Vinograd?
Vinograd.
Vinograd.
Well, before I'll try and be brief, because it seems like we have about 15, 20 minutes left, and I really want to give room for people's comments and questions. But Why am I? Well, first of all, I just loved her work, particularly the what she calls the Book of Jerusalem poems, which is more than anything else she wrote, what she received the most acclaim for, because these poems sort of arrived at her. I think we all know as creative people what it's like for inspiration to arrive out of nowhere, but sometimes it's to the extent we almost feel inhabited by the spirit of the inspiration. She felt like her hand was being guided, like she didn't write these poems. They're wholly different than anything she wrote before. Each poem is a conversation between an anthropomorphized God and city of Jerusalem. God, whatever that is God, and Jerusalem is a city of stone, but they're personified, and each poem is a dialogue. And I actually went to live in Israel when I was 25 to film these poems. And I recorded her. I actually sat in her bedroom when I was 25 and recorded her with reading these poems. And I have them to this day, all these decades later. So we'll hear her reading them as we see my visualization. And I'm going to return to Israel again, hopefully in the fall if the funding is there. But the film is about more than the Jerusalem poems, as I mentioned. And I'm really interested in how someone who came from an upwardly mobile background, father won a Nobel Prize, mother taught poetry at UC and was published in the New Yorker, upper middle class, but she lived a very downwardly mobile life. She lived in SSI for most of her life. She ate basically one meal a day for most of her adult life. If she didn't sell her books, so she was a very aggressive hawker of her books on the street. If she didn't sell any books, she didn't eat. And she was extremely prolific, published over 70 books in her lifetime. And her focus was people on the margins, like herself, street people, street performers, People's Park activists, people who lived in the park. She really championed voices that we don't hear. Her writing is pretty much very sort of straightforward, literal, very observational, but it's very cinematic, and I love the visual quality of it. But again, particularly the Jerusalem poems, because they literally to this day are spine chilling. And again, all of you, are you making work that chills your spine? Are you so obsessively impassioned about what you're making the film that you have an embodied reaction to it? I think that's really, really important.
I love
Okay.
that. I love
Should
that.
we open it up?
Yes, an embodied reaction. I love that phrase. All right, who has a question? And I just like to say to my audience, they people who've been here know I like for you to raise your hand on video so I can see. I'm going to start with Priya and then Diane. Hi, Priya. Nice to see you.
Hi, thank you. Ken, thank you so much for being here. I really, really find you incredibly inspiring. And my question was inspired by something that you talked about towards the beginning. And you mentioned that, you know, like, for example, you're kind of sensitive and
Kind of.
and you talked a little bit about the conflict between what it takes to embrace yourself and be an authentic artist versus expectation from outside of you about what successful is and looks like. And so it's just, I'm 35 and I've, done a little bit of work to kind of understand who I am, but obviously I still have a long way to go and it's a constant journey.
Yes.
I find myself like constantly fighting my parts of my personality in some ways, like, oh, I'm too sensitive. So I have to be, have thicker skin, or I'm too broad and I have to really learn to focus very much. So my question for you is, you seem to have really gotten to overall evolve to a point where you really just fully embrace you and like your authenticity. And that comes out in your work. So what did that look like for you? How did you kind of navigate that, if that was at all a struggle for you as you evolved as a human and a filmmaker?
Oh, I think I should go lay on the couch as I respond to that. I mean, would you mind re-articulating your question just a bit more simply, directly?
Yeah, how did you navigate as you evolved as a human and a filmmaker, the conflict between embracing your full self and society's expectations of what you should be like?
You know, I really wish I could give you a simple answer because it's so relative to each person. All I can say is it is not a direct line. That's probably the best thing I can say is surrender, give up, bury any sense that there is a one straight path. Believing that there is one way to do it and one direction is a game killer. It will, I don't care how many YouTube videos that tell you this is the way to do it. Do this like this, do this like that. Other than a purely technical point perspective, like this is the way you light. And even then, obviously there's no one way to light. But in terms of, it's just, and, I don't, and with the word weird, big quotations, but it's like, there was only one you you are not, a nameless, shapeless, amorphous, being. This is not like, we're not in the Matrix yet. That film was an incredible commentary. And that's like the dark side of everything I've been trying to share over the course of this chat. But we still have to, the onus is on no one but you to cultivate, your voice. And I'm glad that you said it's ongoing, because we will be cultivating that oneness, that authenticity, till the day we die. It's not like we ever arrive. So I guess to finish up, I think each moment is a moment of arrival. What do I need right now? I'm feeling hungry. I'm feeling anxious. I'm feeling a little suicidal. I'm feeling frustrated. I'm feeling lonely. Each of those moments or realizations of a particular feeling is a moment to arrive at a better place, a moment to self-direct. Again, the dangerous gift. I'm feeling so anxious right now. I can see myself doing something really, really harmful. Well, are you going to indulge that? Because there used to be a time in my life where I would have dark thoughts and then I would live them out. Okay. So the dangerous gift is I have such a fertile imagination. I can see those things happening and I would subsume to them. The difference is now I notice them and I respond to them with more compassion. So, I'm part of me wants to apologize to everyone if this is all sounding like a big Dharma talk and I'm sounding like a North Californian, hippie, and it's getting too esoteric and too ephemeral, but I really, really do feel that all this stuff speaks to being a filmmaker. I'm feeling a little teary as I say this because I feel it so profoundly. Yeah. It's taken me so many years to really believe this, that for all the power and creativity we put into not taking care of ourselves, well, if we have that ingenuity, we can also use it to take care of ourselves. And to say, I'm struggling to reconcile the things that you just said. Well, instead of just subsuming to that challenge, I can say, well, what the gauntlet's been thrown down. So what can I do? And it's baby steps. That's the other thing. Our culture is all about, I have to make a grand life decision. I have to get the right camera or, the right home or the right romantic partner. And it's, all those things they're all within our reach, but we have to take baby steps toward them. And what those baby steps are is identifying what you need right now in this moment. And then it's like a strip of film, right? A strip of film is made up of multiple frames, and it's the collectivity of them in motion, moving through time. Same perfect metaphor for our lives. So think of any one moment as a frame of film. And if you're just going to sit and look at that one frame of film, it's not going to go anywhere. Got to chuck it in the projector. You got to put it in motion.
Dharma talk, yeah, awesome. Thanks, Priya, for throwing out that massive question. So let's see if we can get to Diane and then Mark. Go ahead, Diane.
Hi, my name is Diane McKenzie. I'm moved to tears that your films are so incredibly beautiful, and the way that you talk about film, to me, it's like, it's just so incredibly heartening, because that, I feel that much love for film. I mean, it's just, I can't imagine doing anything else. I often can't imagine anybody wanting to do anything else. And so it's so incredibly beautiful to hear you talk, regardless of whether it sounds like a Dharma talk. And I do love that you talk about choosing the right camera as a grand decision, because I realize that I'm saying that sort of tongue in cheek, but yeah. Anyway, so, and this is, my question is along the lines of what you've been talking about this entire time. I'm making a documentary right now, and I'm focusing on female artists who have gone through sexual or physical trauma, and celebrating their work and their stories, and truly exploring a lot of the things that you're talking about. And it's anchored on my own story of surviving a rape and a beating. And then I have a very complicated trauma history prior to that. And so clearly I just so related to the Broken Beauty. I just, was so incredibly beautifully done. But so for me, some of the difficulty that I'm having being a subject and the maker of the film, and wanting to honor my own story and the women that I'm focusing on, if you could speak to that in any way. I mean, I know that what you've been talking about is the fact that in a sense you are central to everything that you're doing. But if you could maybe, I don't know if advice is the word, but I know that it's something I'm really struggling with. You know, it's challenging.
What may I ask what specifically you're struggling with?
So because I'm both a subject and the maker of the film, it's like it is challenging navigating that and keeping my, because right now I'm working on fundraising, and obviously I have to wear a very different hat than thinking about it as this is my story, or this is, I still feel that I'm working on, regardless of what piece of it I'm working on, I am doing all that I can to honor myself and the women that I'm working with. But that challenge of this is my story, and I'm wanting to explore the more universal aspects. I feel very, very strongly about, we're in a place that violence against human beings is just something that it needs to stop in the way that it's going on right now. And for me, specifically working with women around rape prevention.
Please practice good self-care while you're making this very, very vital, important film, because you're interested in these women because of your own unfortunate experiences. But you're going to take a deep dive into these stories, and by proxy, it's going to make you take a deep dive into yourself. Right. Which is I know that very, very, very well. It's going to take a lot of fortitude, but they inform one another too. Right. You're doing good work. And as you process these stories, you'll also be processing, your own experience. But please take care of yourself along the way. Okay. Well, thank you. And thank you for speaking with us this morning.
That's a great
yeah. Thanks. Thank you, Joanne.
I'm happy to keep on going. I feel like there's so much more we can talk about, and I just really, we've opened up a space here, and I want to give everyone a chance. So, do you mind if we keep going, Joanne?
Certainly don't mind. I don't mind at all. Go ahead, Mark, with your question.
So, first of all, Ken, thank you so much for being here and for being who you are. I so much resonate with what you've been saying. Your films are beautiful. I understand going from experimental films to more of a narrative beginning, middle, and end film. I resonated with you because my I'm working on my second feature film, which I hope to complete in a 2.5-year period. My first feature, which is on PBS right now, took 10 years.
Wow.
And I can't do that anymore. But before COVID hit, I was using a similar model to yours, where I was going to universities and art museums, and they were flying me out, and there would be a Q&A, and sometimes we sold DVDs, and sometimes we didn't. But once COVID hit, I stopped that because you can't travel. So my question is, have you made the switch to virtual appearances and programs? And if so, how are you doing that?
I haven't yet because, and obviously I will eventually, like all of us, but I haven't thus far because my last film I finished 2 years ago. And for various reasons, that film just didn't do as well, didn't reach an audience the way my prior work had. So I've just been working on this film for the last year. And that's really what my focus is now. I will say that COVID or no COVID, this is a really increasingly auspicious time for filmmakers in terms of reaching their audience, because as the cloud becomes more robust, it's going to be easier and easier for us to distribute and stream ourselves and not have to use a distributor and not have to pay someone to stream films for us. So with Crooked Beauty 10 years ago, Amazon had a robust enough infrastructure where they would stream the film for me. And now, there's the name of an up and coming organization. Is it called the Screening Room?
Huh.
I can't think of it, but maybe I'll when I find it afterwards, I'll send it to Joanne and she could send it to you. But there are a lot of these people are coming up from the grassroots now, other independent filmmakers, because of the accessibility of the medium, where they can now create distribution models online that allow you to do it yourself. And I'm really, really excited. So I'm really excited for 2 years from now. It won't be like as you all probably know, showing your films on Zoom is just awful. It stutters. The sound is often out of sync with the image. And I thought, well, how can that, especially with COVID, I thought someone would have been on this by now. I've talked to a lot of teachers. I'm like, well, what do you do when you show films? And the best they've been able to tell me is that they put something on, they put a URL in the chat. They tell the students to go off and watch and then come back.
Right.
I mean, it's ridiculous.
So Ken, I just had an experience where a theater had a streaming session with a Q&A, an intro Q&A streaming session. And they sent me the name of the program because it was like Zoom. There were 200 people on it, but the quality of the streaming was really great.
Fantastic.
I'll make a point of sending that to Joanne. So
Yeah.
you can get it. But it was really, really like an enjoyable experience for me as a filmmaker to see my film streaming. And so it's another platform. I can't remember the name of it, but I have it and I'll send it to you.
Fantastic. Yeah. And I was digressing too much. The short answer to you're saying is nothing specific going on for me now, but I think the good news for all of us is that it's getting better all the time. And just the way that, unfortunately, the pandemic has made us, accelerate finding a vaccine. What the pandemic is giving us as media makers is accelerated the outreach and presentation models for us.
I feel like we've been pushed 5 or 10 years into the future.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Does anybody else have a question?
I know that everyone has something to say. I can see it in your faces. I see the little thought bubbles.
They've been writing things in the chat, which always I'm like, don't say it, raise your hand.
Oh, well, if someone has a question that they wrote.
No, there were no questions. I don't. I don't think. People just saying it was great. You were great. Does
I
any-
have one.
Hi, Joanne.
Oh, Dr. Alberta. And then Kyle. We'll have Dr. Alberta. Dr. Alberta's calling in from Trinidad and Tobago. So,
Wow.
yeah. Go ahead.
Hello. Thanks for sharing. I'm interested to find out what type of distribution model you possibly looking to use for this present project you're working on.
Great.
Well, I think, like I said, right now, I'm not so much thinking about a model in terms of a platform. I'm just always thinking about audience all the time. So since the film is about a poet and I'm writing grants like crazy right now, and of course, grants these days, it's not enough to just have a synopsis and an artistic approach and your funding plan and a timeline. They want a fully formed distribution plan. And what that often means is identifying the very specific, they want to know, I think what they're more interested in is not necessarily how you're going to reach people. That's part of it, obviously, but who is your audience? Because implicit with the question, answering the question of who your audience is, then you start thinking about how I'll reach those people. So, for example, since my film's about a poet, I'm thinking about literature audiences. But since she was also a poet who lived with disabilities, well, are there writing programs specifically for people with disabilities? That's just a very short answer, but I think hopefully it just underscores the importance of knowing who your audience is. And that's an ongoing process. It's not like, oh, they are this. What's really, you should keep like a journal. I mean, this may just sound really obvious, but over the course of making your film, your idea of the film is constantly being refined. The log line you wrote for your first grant or your first initial seed of inspiration to make a film is going to be very different from the log line 3 years down the road. My synopsis is constantly changing. And of course, in tandem with how I think about the film changing is also how I think about myself changing. So my own bio on my website, as Joanne and her assistant know, up till this morning, I was still sending them, change this word on how I describe myself. It's ongoing. It's like, again, a way of coming around to what the very first person's question was. Who was it? Priya. Any one moment, we're changing how we think about our film subject, about filmmaking, about who we are as makers, and who our audience is and how we'll reach them. It's the landscape for all these facets of being a filmmaker are constantly shifting. Being a filmmaker is not just about having the camera. It's how enlivened you are in your life. And that is as important to being a filmmaker as the tools and the right perfect distribution method is. It's a matrix of all these things. You wear a lot of hats as a filmmaker, but you don't have to do them all yourself. The more people you can have on your team, I want to say the better, but that doesn't mean it's impossible either. I do feel that democratization of filmmaking has made it easier for people who are solo acts. Everything's become more accessible. I'm still very much a one-man show, frankly, but I do know that the more people I brought on my team, mostly in post-production, but because I'm so, I was going to say ignorant. I'm trying to be a little more practice self-compassion, but like the technical side of things is very elusive. I'm fortunate that my life partner is an editor who's very, very good with technology. I have meltdowns very easily when it comes to operating a computer. But it's good to have someone on your team who can help you with the things that you're not good in, whether they're distribution or anything. So that's a really long answer to your question. I tend to digress a bit, sorry. But I hope it was all grist for consideration in some way.
Kyle is going to ask a question now. Kyle, you've been driving this whole time. Are you on some long road trip or something? And you have like a whole team of people in the car with you.
Right. It's my mom and my
Can you
girlfriend.
unmute? Oh, there you are.
No, you put him on mute. Kyle, you need to be off mute.
unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that. It's my mom and my girlfriend, and we're driving from Martha's Vineyard back to Boston.
Hey,
So yeah, we took a boat to the car. Now we're on the highway in the middle of nowhere, almost out of Massachusetts into Boston. But it was an incredible talk. I learned so much. I'm really excited to watch your films. The core of psychology, like, you know, I think that aspect of your films is probably what makes it so universal, you were saying, in the distribution. And I think, you know, my question was, if, you know, you've learned of any other like thematically universal concepts that relate to an audience like that, like psychology, that kind of like tap into your audience, you know, with filmmaking, in terms of like finding something that's so easy for people to have empathy about.
boy, you guys, did Priya tell you to ask that question? You guys are asking these they're wonderful questions, but they're so expansive. And, you know, my kind of mind, when I hear questions like these, I go off in 20 directions. Let me say this, all right? This is what comes to mind. My mission in my work is to reach the mind through the heart with beauty as the gateway. Beauty could be relevant to the person. One culture's standard or notion or experience of beauty may be different from the next. But to me, there's something very universal about beauty. Who's going to look at a sunset, just to be, you know, very superficial, and say that isn't beautiful? So I think we all want some sort of pleasure when we see a film, even if it's about a dark subject. I'm not talking about making something that's dark and painful beautiful. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not trying to romanticize dark passages of the soul. But I think we can present them in a way that's transformative. And, you know, you look at Crooked Beauty. I mean, it's a really beautiful film. The title is Crooked Beauty. So the darkness and the lightness are interdependent. You know, that's film. You know, you have these frames of light that are separated by a sliver of darkness, right? Even though video still has an on-off quality. It's you know, metaphorically speaking and literally speaking. So I think about that a lot in my filmmaking. If there's anything universalizing, is that just like people, you know, people are a balancing act between shades of light and darkness, as is the medium itself. So when I'm looking at an image, I think there's a problem in documentary filmmaking, that they're also often so literal. We are seeing what's being said. It's just descriptive, you know, you're telling rather than evoking. I'm not saying that all documentaries need to be art films, right, but I think the potential there in the medium to bring us to a place that's much larger than the limits of our own flesh and bone is an intoxicating premise. You know, it's really, really exciting. I want to leave the theater. I want to leave the ballet. I want to leave the poetry reading much, much, much larger than when I arrived there. And that's something that's a potential that we have. That's a universalizing potential. All human beings, regardless of your background, your experience, have the potential to experience that when they leave your film. And I think about those things. I have this ongoing conversation with my partner about this. She feels like, my sense is like she feels I'm shooting too high, you know. But I feel I have a little problem articulating this, but I know I feel it in my belly. I feel it like, you know, a beating life. The film always starts like, oh, I'm pregnant now, you know, and this thing's growing in me. And I don't know what it's going to look like, but it's going to be hungry when it gets out, and it's going to need to be fed. And your film is that child, and it's being fed by the attention of, you know, the people who are watching it. But, you know, they're not going to feed it if it isn't something that isn't, you know, opening up a space, if it's not inviting people in for their attention. So think about how your work is an invitation as opposed to a declaration, a proclamation. There are films that do that, but you know, I like art in any medium, but especially film that opens up a space for reflection, contemplation, and makes me feel like I want to step out into the world, you know, with hope and resilience.
That was a good answer.
Wow, incredible. Thank you.
That was great. Does anybody else have a question?
Let's say this has been a great gift, Ken. Thank you so much. I'm so inspired by what your words are.
Well, it's also a gift for me that you all attended. I really mean that. There have been a lot of times over the course of this chat that I've gotten a little teary. Just hearing you say that makes me feel teary because, you know, we all want to be heard, right? We all want a dynamic. And in this time of pandemic, just in general, pandemic or no pandemic, but, you know, we're on lockdown. It's my partner and I find it very slippery. We go out into the world, we have a rare interconnection with someone, and then I come back, a connection rather with someone, or even a close friend. Then you come back home and said, that was really disquieting. I said this, I said that, and I feel like such an idiot. And this is just a really difficult time. And as a filmmakers, as you know, we spend a lot of time just us alone, indoors, staring at the screen or at the work, and there's a kind of isolation there too. But you know, there are openings there too, and this connection that we have right now, even though it's in a virtual space, is a kind of an opening. And I'm really grateful for you all helping me open up a bit during this time of tremendous closure. Thank you. I'm really grateful.
Yeah, thank you so much. Somebody who's on this call who's been very quiet today reminded me the other day that I'm a shaman. And there was a moment during your talk when I just realized you keep using the phrase about opening up a space, but you truly opened up a space it was absolutely beautiful. And when you look at your films, you're doing that as well. And I just really understood. I really had an experience of that happening during the talk. So
thank you so much. And I want to encourage anyone, if you want to email me, you're more than welcome to. I'd even be cool with having an occasional Zoom chat. Honestly, I would love that. I'd be very happy to. And, you know I can be very verbal, but I'm actually a really good listener too. So I promise not to make it about me. That's something I've struggled with my whole life. It's something I still struggle with. But when I got involved with mental health, you know, I'll close with this, you know, I was doing workshops, not just presentations, but workshops. And the person who was helping organize them came to me afterwards and said, you know, Ken, every time someone spoke, you then went on a long tangent about yourself. And it really planted to see, like, I need to be more mindful. If I am opening up space for people to speak, I got to let them speak. It's fun and fascinating to hear people's stories and to share your experience. But it's important to cultivate empathy by listening. So if people do reach out to me, I promise to receive you as open-heartedly as I can.
you know, Ken, I forgot to ask you this question, a practical question, but we had talked about, we wanted to share with you all Crooked Beauty so that you could see Crooked Beauty, right? But yesterday or something, day before, Ken also shared a work sample from his current film. And I meant to ask you, Ken, why did you do that? Was it that you were kind of open to hearing what people are saying about where, you know, the film, where it's at? I wanted to ask you that, but I meant to ask it privately, not when everybody was listening.
Well, it's a combination of a couple things. Part of it is just outreach, you know, that link is on a donation